Hello. A few years ago, I was asked to contribute a chapter on the Sunday Journal newspaper for a collection of essays called The Sunday Papers, A History of Ireland's Weekly Press. The book was to be published by Four Courts Press in December 2018, and you can get a copy in your local library. It's an excellent book. I identified a few people who had worked for the Sunday Journal, and I contacted them asking for an interview. And I was fortunate to get responses from four of the paper's editorial staff, and they spoke to me very helpfully about their experience of working with the paper and having a rather controversial insurance man as a proprietor. I headed my chapter in the book with a quotation from Francis Xavier Carty, who had written a book called Elections 82, What the Paper Said, an analysis of press coverage of the 1982 general elections in the Republic of Ireland. And despite the unwieldy title, it's a fascinating read. So what Carty said was, what had started with some promise as a Sunday farming paper and gone adrift, had then, under the ownership of motor insurance boss Joe Moore, become a mediocre fifth national Sunday paper, never likely to survive in a market where it clearly had no place. And you can see here the titles of the existing Sunday papers at the time, all of which, especially the Sunday World and the Sunday Independent, were doing extremely well. But initially, what I had been told about the Sunday Journal echoed the criticism that had come from Francis Xavier Carty. And it was also supported by a large body of contemporary criticism in other newspapers at the time. So what I did a few weeks ago in the Central Library was reprise some of the chapter I wrote for the Sunday Papers book, but I was also taking the story a bit further to consider Joe Moore's last days as an insurance man. The original piece was primarily about what I called the short and troubled life of the Sunday Journal. So if you're interested in newspaper history, I suggest you pick up a copy of the book, because that's not by no means the only article, and they're all quite fascinating about different aspects of weekly papers in Ireland, not just in the 20th century, but previously. But back to Joe Moore. According to Terry Claven's entry in the Dictionary of Irish Biography, his entry about Joe Moore, the man had been born in Mountrath, County Laois in 1908, and he was the son of a farmer. He trained as a primary teacher and he taught for 5 years before becoming a civil servant. Sorry, I'm just getting the usual notifications that I don't want. I really will have to have a word with the browser. But in November 1951, he joined the New Ross branch of the private Motorists Protection Association, the PMPA. And he was soon elected to the national executive, the following May, in fact, so not even a year. By March of 1953, he had been made trustee, honorary secretary, and honorary treasurer. In 1955, his first attempt to establish an insurance company by raising money from PMPA members failed, but in 1958 he did succeed by forming the private Motorists Provident Society, PMPS. This was initially to provide a car damage scheme and then to exploit the fairly lax regulation of provident societies at the time by expanding into advancing car loans. By 1961, Moore had retired from the civil service and he received his insurance scheme as PMPA's general manager, he revived it. So not long afterwards, he moved to Dublin. In the mid-1970s, the PMPA board gave more total control over all investment decisions. He then embarked on a series of what were to be, in the long term, loss-making investments, including the acquisition of McBurney's department store. I think there's a Spar now on it, and some smaller stores, but it's had a few different incarnations since Moore made a mess of it and it failed. The McKern's Motor Group was another one that had been doing well until he bought it, and of course the Sunday Journal newspaper. So looking at his career in the brief overview, until his last few years in charge of the PMPA and the PMPS, it might have seemed that this was a talented man whose organisational skill was recognised by frequent promotion and the assignment of more and more responsibility to him. But on the contrary, while he may have had some ability in business, his rising power owed far more to his aggressive demeanour and his refusal to take no for an answer. He was a lifelong Fianna Fáil supporter who used political connections to further his ambitions, but he wasn't above bearing grudges against politicians who did not give him his own way, regardless of which party they belonged to. So the original inspiration for the foundation of the Sunday Journal had come from a former deputy editor of the Sunday World called Tony Fitzpatrick, who believed there was an opening for a newspaper focused on agriculture and a farming readership. Excuse me. The financing came from a Donegal man called Frank McCrossan and a British businessman, Charles de Selencourt, who was based in London. Now, when it was launched, the paper employed a small team of very well qualified and experienced journalists who were enthusiastic for the new project and its target audience. And they weren't deterred by the existence of the Farmers' Journal and the Farming Independent, both of which already had a fairly substantial following. The journalists included the four people whom I interviewed. Michael Miley was the first editor, with Fitzpatrick as managing editor, though I never did get to meet Fitzpatrick or to talk to him. Willie Keeley took over as editor after Miley later resigned, and he went on to edit the Sunday Independent before retiring in 2015, although I think he still writes colour pieces. And Judith Elms came with Fitzpatrick from the Sunday World, and she ran a very progressive women's section in the Sunday Journal, and she became the women's editor. Jim Orkney, unfortunately didn't get a photograph of him, came from business and finance as an agricultural correspondent. Now, at this point, I should apologise for the poor quality of some of my photographs. I took quite a lot when I was researching this in the National Library. I love to use photographs, as people might have realised. But I read through all of the issues that were kept in the National Library of the Sunday Journal, but they're in the big binders, and it's not always possible to straighten them out. You don't want to do any damage. And I could have asked the staff to do it, but as everyone knows who's embarked on independent research with no budget, you'll be aware of the need not to run up big bills. So I decided to do it, the photography myself. And as I said, unfortunately, the result wasn't always brilliant. But the quality of the journalists who came to the Sunday Journal, moving from successful careers elsewhere, is an indication of the impact that Fitzpatrick had on them and the promise he offered of a very high quality publication. For instance, the Sunday Journal had all the printing equipment in one place in their Parliament Street premises. And although that must have been a very significant expense to set up, it was unusual at the time. The visual appeal of the tabloid format was enhanced by the initial high standard of its content, but they were up against some fairly formidable competition. Michael Miley said that the strength of the Sunday Journal team came from their network of contacts, particularly in the agribusiness industry and in farm organisation. These contacts gave them the opportunity to lead with a lot of good stories at a time when there was, as Miley said, a lot of stuff going on. He referred in particular to the Larry Goodman saga. He said Larry Goodman at the time was beginning to build his empire, and we broke a couple of stories on companies that he had bought, and he tried to stop us. I remember there was one particular story, and I think we put it on the front page or page 3, that he had bought a plant in Bagnallstown in Carlow, and it was totally denied that he did it. I had a very good source, and we took a chance and went on it. The guy guaranteed me that he would pay the libel costs if we were sued, and it turned out that they had an arrangement with the Haughey government that they would launch the new venture on the following Wednesday, but we blew it on the Sunday. So they were out there ahead of the pack. So with similarly fearless journalism, they published many stories in the first few months of operations. Everything seemed to be going fine for the Sunday Journal until the money that the backers had put up ran out more quickly than expected. And by June of 1980, the paper was on the verge of closure. Tony Fitzpatrick approached Joe Moore to ask for his support. You can see here 2 separate stories in the Irish Times about the PMPA buyout of the paper. This is the launch, and this is what happened just a few months later. So it wasn't a straightforward affair. There were considerable accrued debts. And initially, the original financial backers refused the offer that Joe Moore made at Tony Fitzpatrick's request. Shanahan reported on the front page of the Irish Times on 3rd of July 1980 that the Sunday Journal was in danger of closing that week. She wrote, "The reason is a boardroom battle, with the major financial backer refusing to continue financing the publication without getting more control of the week-to-week running of the paper." The Irish press reported on a statement from editor Michael Miley that the Sunday Journal had achieved a circulation of 50,000, but it had lost just over 250,000 since it was launched, and advertising never reached the level expected by the backers. Nevertheless, staff had only learned how bad things were in the few days preceding an application for a liquidator. With the withdrawal of the financial backers by the end of June, the only way the paper could continue to be published was by the efforts of the staff themselves, who occupied the premises in Parliament Street and kept everything going. Short-term finance was sourced, which included contributions from staff members. The NUJ, the National Union of Journalists, issued a statement saying that they were trying to continue publication because of their confidence in the viability of the newspaper if it developed as originally envisaged. This is where Moore came on board at the beginning of July. The single largest debtor was Frank McRossan, who had rejected Joe Moore's original buyout offer. However, which included the PMPA taking on the Sunday Journal's liabilities, was accepted. Tony Fitzpatrick would remain as managing editor, and no redundancies were expected, although the 22 staff would be expected to adapt to the more, I quote, urban-oriented approach that was to be introduced. Joe Moore told the Irish Examiner that his aim would be to make the Sunday Journal more like the Sunday World, but not as brash. The paper was to be printed by the PMPA Printworks in Portlaoise, so they were bringing some assets as well in terms of already owned equipment and facilities. A few weeks later, the Irish Times reported that the legal formalities concerning the purchase of the Sunday Journal by PMPA had been completed. So the former directors had resigned and 4 new directors had been appointed, and they were Joe Moore himself as chairman, Michael J. Dorr, Hugh Sheridan and Seamus O'Morgan, the latter being the secretary. Clearance of the transaction under the Monopolies and Mergers Act had been obtained from the Department of Industry and Commerce and Tourism. Now, neither Michael Miley nor Willie Keeley was impressed by Joe Moore's plans for the Sunday Journal. As you see here, Willie Keeley said, "I remember going to a meeting when he took over. I went over to PMPA headquarters and went into a boardroom where he was, and he was telling us how great it was going to be. I wondered, was he going to put money into it? Was he going to invest in it? Is he going to promote it? Or what's he going to do? I said, what is your secret? What are you going to use to see sales maintained or increased? He said, we'll use my charisma. Great, I thought, we're home and away. We're going to have Joe's charisma, and that was going to be it. It is possible that Moore believed he brought more to the table than cash and charisma, and he wasn't bringing as much cash as was needed. He had been editor of the PMPA newsletter, after all, for over 20 years, and he may have thought that qualified him to be a journalist. He didn't want the Sunday Journal to continue as a farming paper, which was rather bizarre given that that's where its success initially had come from and from the expertise of the staff. His intention was to change its focus to general features with some news, but with a strong motoring emphasis. Sean McLean, an operations manager in the PMPA, was appointed as the temporary general manager of the paper until the position could be filled on a permanent basis. His remit was to cut the costs of the Sunday Journal and to keep them down in the future. Willie Keeley remembered McLean as a nice man who didn't relish his axeman role and whose job would have been made immeasurably more difficult because whatever chance of survival the paper had in its original focus, when it did get a lot of approval from readers, it was madness to try to compete with the existing weeklies, particularly the Sunday World. Judith Elms believed that the situation was exacerbated because it was never made clear to the potential readership that the paper had widened its brief, that it was no longer primarily for a farming audience, and this had an immediate impact on advertising sales. She said, "That's why I feel that the general public was never made aware of that. Such advertising as there was aimed differently, and people didn't know what they might be buying if they bought it. In the early use, it was all tractors and feeds and results from the marts around the country. But as you can see here, it was quite different by the time Moore got his hands on the paper. So the first indications that the changed editorial policy would be a problem came in September of 1980, when it was reported in other papers that Michael Miley would be resigning as editor of the Sunday Journal. Willie Keeley had written a story about an internal Fianna Fáil poll that identified significant concern among party members about the impact of Charlie Haughey's leadership on voters. He said, "I started checking around. I wrote the story and Tony said it couldn't go on the front page. It wasn't that Moore spiked it." Michael Miley also remembered that it was Tony Fitzpatrick who told him to move the story from the front page. He didn't know for sure whether Fitzpatrick had been approached by McLean acting on Moore's behalf, but he said, given the precarious situation of the paper in the preceding months and the hardship endured by the staff in keeping it going, he decided not to fight the downgrading of the story from the front page. He didn't resign because of it, but the incident certainly contributed to his decision to move on. There wasn't really a gap in the market, he said, with the Sunday World, the Sunday Independent, the Sunday Press, and the Sunday Tribune was there at the same time. I saw this becoming a mishmash of nothing, not having a clue where it was going to be going in the future, and I decided to leave. I had a meeting with him after that, and he brought up the story, and he said it was only a load of rubbish anyway, no matter what party it was. He wouldn't credit the story. The NUJ chapel members employed by the Sunday Journal met management to discuss editorial policy. Joe Moore issued a statement to the press saying he had nothing to do with the day-to-day running of the paper. Now, Tony Fitzpatrick certainly had close links with Fianna Fáil, and particularly with Charles Haughey. In the 1970s, he'd worked for Mark Press, which was a public relations firm which Fianna Fáil government once employed to improve Ireland's image abroad. And Fitzpatrick was to become the party's press officer in the 1981 election campaign. And of course, Joe Moore was one of Haughey's most fervent supporters. When the PMPA had been set up initially, they had difficulty getting a license from the Department of Industry and Commerce and its minister, then Jack Lynch. Writing in the aftermath of the PMPA's financial collapse in 1983, Olivia O'Leary considered why Moore was so devoted to Haughey. Moore resented the department's reluctance and that of Lynch. He took it as a personal reflection on himself, and it may explain his subsequent fervent support for Charles Haughey in the 1979 ousting of the Lynch camp. Certainly, Joe Moore took many things personally, and during the 1980s, after the bailout of the PMPA by the Irish government, stories kept popping up in various outlets of grudges he had held, particularly against politicians who had not done the right thing in terms of himself or indeed Charles Haughey. So the front page of the first issue under the new management carried a confident message in full colour. Said, "We're back." And it said, with a promise that your favourite Sunday newspaper is going to offer you much, much more in the weeks to come. More news, more pictures, more competitions. There will always be so much more to read in the Sunday Journal, the family paper you can feel proud to be seen with. Our sincere thanks to the many readers who encouraged us with their letters and phone calls during the last few weeks. Now, it's hard to know how much of that material was genuine. Certainly, there were lots of letters in the first weeks of the original iteration of the paper, offering considerable support and approval. But I would suspect that if there were that many, that Moore would have used some of them. However, maybe I'm being overly suspicious. The paper was rebranded as a family paper, and this was reflected in the content. As promised, there were increasing numbers of competitions, accompanied by the introduction of horoscope pages, a children's section, a lot more celebrity gossip and lifestyle features. In 1981, an 8-page motoring supplement was introduced. Willie Keeley continued to lead the remaining team, but they were often under considerable pressure. He remembered that there were so few resources that he could often find himself writing half the paper. Over the remaining life of the Sunday Journal, the substantial news elements of the paper continued to decrease in terms of the number of pages devoted to them, although several major stories were broken about topics concerned with agriculture and agribusiness. Throughout 1981, there was an increase in the numbers of freelance writers who contributed celebrity gossip and lifestyle stories. Towards the end of 1981 and into 1982, infomercial features were appearing more frequently. The move away from the serious journalism espoused in the early incarnation of the Sunday Journal did not have the impact that Joe Moore had expected, and sales figures continued to fall, as did advertising revenue. In August 1981, a new managing editor was appointed to replace Tony Fitzpatrick, who was taking up an appointment as press officer with Fianna Fáil. The new managing editor was Dan Carmody, who was also the managing editor of the Leinster Express, which was owned by the PMPA, and the Kilkenny Standard. Fitzpatrick was replacing Frank Dunlop as press officer of Fianna Fáil, Dunlop having been seconded to the Department of Education, serving a Fine Gael minister, John Boland. For anyone who doesn't remember, just a quick reminder that Frank Dunlop was the bagman for a number of property developers who bribed corrupt politicians for assistance with planning and zoning matters. He was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment in 2008 and served 14 months of that. In a Saturday column item in the Irish Times about the Fianna Fáil plans to challenge Gareth Fitzgerald's Fine Gael, Conor O'Clery wrote, Tony Fitzpatrick is seen as first and foremost a PR man, personally loyal to Charlie Haughey rather than the party. And that did cause problems. However, I'm not going into that now. In December 1981, the Sunday Journal carried a 2-page spread of predictions for the coming year, none of which concerned the demise of the paper itself or the 2 general elections that were to happen in February and November. By January 1982, the paper had been reduced from 48 pages to 40, and the motoring supplement had been downsized proportionately. There was little political coverage in the Sunday Journal in the lead up to the February general election. Willie Keeley's story on the revolt in the Labour Party against then leader Michael O'Leary made the front page. Later in the year, O'Leary resigned from the party and joined Fine Gael. But while there was relatively scant coverage of the February election campaign, the paper did carry some advertising for Fianna Fáil and none for the other parties. There was little in the way of examination of the events, personalities, and issues of the election. Writing in 1983, following a claim by Albert Reynolds that the Irish media had been running a witch hunt against Charlie Haughey, public relations expert and academic, whom I've already referred to, Francis Xavier Carty's detailed analysis of the newspaper coverage showed that the opposite was the case. His scoring was influenced by the stance of the editorial and other serious opinion columns in the national newspapers, the selection of page 1 lead story, the choice of headings, and the emphasis given to issues, personality, and their effects. And you can see, this is what Joe Moore thought women were interested in. May not have been wrong, but there were other things. The results of the research are summarised here, followed by his analysis of the Sunday Journal's coverage of the February 1982 election. And you can see here that the score out of 100, the Sunday Journal covered 55%, or at least 55 out of 100. And those scores decreased as you go down through the main papers. The coalition didn't do, it wasn't even mentioned in the Sunday Journal, and had a reasonable spread, I suppose, across the other newspapers. Now, on January the 31st, 1982, the Sunday Journal had an editorial declaring that the sensible thing would seem to be to vote for Fianna Fáil, and emphasis was laid on Fianna Fáil's merits. Nor was there, the February 7th issue, just before the election, was weak on coverage and comment. Nor was there any real attempt on February 14th to cover the election. But what was given was weak and generally feeble, superficial and friendly to Fianna Fáil. The editorial was insulting to the readers in its simplicity, giving all the superficial benefits promised by Fianna Fáil, all the soft options with no regard for the deeper issues. We know how well that turned out. So really, at this stage, by the time the second general election of 1982 actually happened in November, the Sunday Journal was no more. It wouldn't be fair to totally describe the Sunday Journal as a Fianna Fáil paper, although the connections between Joe Moore, Tony Fitzpatrick and the party certainly seem to have influenced its approach to national politics. Ireland did not need another national newspaper then, or certainly now, and given the size of the population, it was never going to be sustainable regardless of the content. The last issue of the Sunday Journal was published on June 23rd, 1982. Sorry, I've gone ahead a bit too far. Most of the paper was given over to coverage of the unfolding scandal in Éireann Foods at the time. There were no references at all to difficult negotiations that were going on in the background in efforts to keep the paper going. It was widely reported elsewhere that the PMPA had lost more than £1 million on its ownership of the paper. Liam Collins wrote in the Irish Independent on 24th of June about the Sunday Journal's last edition. When the axe finally fell on this ailing Sunday Journal newspaper, it showed that chinks exist in even the strongest armour. An armour doesn't come much stronger than that of Mr. Joe Moore, probably one of Ireland's best known businessmen. Yesterday, as the city's worst kept secret finally surfaced as fact, he had to admit to a major business failure, and a public one at that. It is not something any tycoon relishes, especially a man like Joe Moore, who has always wanted his own national newspaper. There were 25 people working for the Sunday Journal when it was closed by the PMPA on June 24th, 1982. 13 of the staff were members of the NUJ, and the remainder were members of the ITGWU, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. They met with management in the aftermath of the closure, and a deal was worked out. Redundancy payments were never likely to be significant, given the short lifetime of the paper, but Willie Keeley was credited by staff with negotiating the best compensation possible in the circumstances. The Sunday Journal is not well remembered as part of Ireland's weekly press. It was conceived as one thing and rapidly developed into what Michael Miley described as a mishmash. Joe Moore's intervention in July 1980 was no doubt welcome to the people working for the paper, who had made heroic efforts to keep it running when it was first threatened with closure. Unfortunately, his desire to own a national paper and the self-belief that facilitated his creation of the PMPA also explained his failure to benefit from the expertise of the specialist journalists who were responsible for the initial success of the paper with its intended farming market. On October 21st, 1983, the High Court appointed Kevin Kelly as administrator of the PMPA, following a petition by then Minister for Industry and Commerce, Des O'Malley. Joe Moore was dismissed in the following month, leaving the PMPA in massive financial distress. The resulting government bailout of the insurance company took over 30 years to complete and cost the Irish taxpayers $230 million, equivalent to 2% of GNP over those years. The losses were resolved by the imposition of a levy on all non-life insurance premia until 1993. So the appeal to ordinary people that Joe Moore and the PMPA originally had of cheaper car insurance was totally undone by the imposition of the levy as a result of his mismanagement. In 2006, the chairman of a group representing former PMPS depositors said that the PMPA group should never have been folded. The chairman said that the fault for the collapse of the group lay with the politicians who did not protect it. Now, this was definitely not a view held by reputable financial analysts who had been warning Moore and the PMPA board that their approach to cash flow management was undermining the company's standing as an insurer. Bill Hardy, the chairman, had pointed out that most depositors with PMPS were elderly and had modest deposits. There were 15,000 depositors originally, with average savings of £1,400, a lot of it intended to pay for funerals. Hardy said that many of the depositors were now dead, and this was not even 20 years later, and had never received their money back. But in fact, the legislation enacted in 1983 had enabled the government to add a 10-year levy on all non-life insurance premiums, as I said. And the depositors group had believed that Moore, I quote, was a god because he had been introducing cheap insurance when English companies were thought to be overcharging for cover. But in reality, he was recklessly manipulating share capital, among other breaches of financial probity, and the PMPA was dangerously underfunded for the numbers of pending claims. The PMPA was donating liberally to Fianna Fáil, disproportionately allocated its huge body of legal work to Fianna Fáil barristers, and employed many party activists in the company. While he was close to the Haughey wing of the party, Joe Moore did not get on with Des O'Malley, because Moore believed he had wrongly obstructed the licence for the PMPA when he'd been Minister for Industry and Commerce. It was O'Malley who pushed for an audit of the PMPA's books in May 1982 by consultants who provided the evidence to have Moore dismissed. Somewhat like Sean Quinn in recent years, he got plenty of local sympathy until it was revealed how much he had been aggressively pushing the sale of worthless PMPS shares to the PMPA at some considerable benefit to himself. For years, the company had been buying property, garages, office blocks, and even the department store I mentioned earlier, but they were so badly managed that there would not be sufficient return on selling them to pay off the debts. As the emergency and legislation was going through the Oireachtas to enable the levy on insurance premium, Moore sold 1 million PMPA shares to its PMPS deposit-taking subsidiary for £400,000. The cheque wasn't cleared by the bank, and after a court case in which Moore was sued by the PMPS for the return of the money, the High Court judge ruled that he paid the £400,000 plus £250,000 in interest. He continued to be embroiled in various cases until he was confined to a nursing home, where he died on the 20th of June 1989. In the end, it was obvious that Joe Moore's charisma was not adequate to his ambitions, and the self-belief and bombast that had served him well throughout his career failed him at the end. Buying the Sunday Journal was not his only poor decision, but like so many others of his ventures, other people ended up paying the price for his vanity. Thank you for listening.